going. I wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us in today's TPA Masterclass on the international podcast deal-making scene, very relevant in the here and now. Before we get started, I really want to thank our community building sponsor, Wondery, for underwriting this program with the Podcast Academy, or TPA as I call it. TPA is a 1,000-strong virtual community across the world, hence this global topic. And if you aren't yet a TPA member, please do join us. We need your talents. It is definitely an amazing peer-to-peer network across the spectrum of different types of podcasting roles. Before we get too far into this, I'm going to mention that folks can submit questions into the Q&A box. So at the very bottom of your Zoom panel, live participants, please open that up, and that is where you can send your questions. We will definitely keep up with you in the chat, but that's where we'll be looking for questions. Anyway, without further ado, really happy to have you here. Thank you all for your patience dialing in from the UK. It's 3 p.m. over there, not 4 p.m. We recognize the time change. Anyway, let me not perseverate upon that. I'm going to go ahead and pass this right over to our wonderful MC, Alexia Bedat. Alexia, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Amanda. My pleasure. Thank you all who dialed into this live. Welcome to all of those of you who are catching this later on demand. My name's Alexia Bedat. I'm a partner at Klaris. We're a media and entertainment boutique based out of New York. It is a real treat to be here today and to talk about this topic that is near and dear to my heart. The number of podcast listeners around the world has reached, we're at, I think, about 464 million. So a lot of people are dialing in, tuning in, streaming, downloading daily. That number is growing. The fastest growing markets, no surprise, are not North America. And so we thought it would be interesting to have this global discussion. And I'm thrilled to be joined by leaders in their respective markets here today, which I will introduce briefly because they will do a much better and more interesting job at telling you about all of the wonderful things they do. So briefly, we have Yi Yang, who is the co-founder and COO of JustPod. It is the China's premier podcast and digital audio company based in Shanghai. They have produced many critically acclaimed audio productions that Yi will talk to you about. A number of interesting co-productions that we'll be touching on as well. And Yi is uniquely positioned to tell us about the market for audio in China. We have Helen Parker, who's dialing in from the UK. Helen Parker also is founder of Chalk and Blade.
Not founder, managing director, sorry.
Managing director, apologies. Managing director of Chalk and Blade. Chalk and Blade is a premier production company in the UK who have also, in addition to creating great programs within the UK, have done interesting productions as well with partnerships, which we'll be hearing about and in this chat as well. Next, we have Stefano Falaha, who's the founder and CEO of Podio, which has become one of the largest, fastest growing podcast platform in the Middle East and North Africa. It's a market that there's been a lot of interesting things that have happening. And so we're really thrilled for you to be dialing in and especially making time in your evening to do so. So thank you. And Lori Martinez, who is the founder of the award-winning multilingual podcast company Studio Ochenta. Lori was originally a New Yorker, but moved to Paris and has experience in the French market, the European market more generally, and so is also able to be a complement to Helen's perspectives from the UK. So without further ado, we'll kick off. And if you can tell us a little bit, I'm sure as we can see amazingly in the chat, people are saying they're dialing in from all over the world. But, if we start from the assumption that a lot of people either dialing in or listening to this later are most familiar with the US market, can you just tell us very briefly when the podcast market really sort of kicked off in your market? How long has it been a thing, and is it a growing business? Is it a mature business? Sort of where are you at in that process? And in no particular order, but Helen, why don't you kick us off from the perspective in the UK?
Sure. So in terms of when it was most popular, I did a little research on this as well. It's the first podcast in the UK was seemingly in 2004. 2008 to 2009 is really when it became a mainstream medium that people started considering and taking seriously. We were founded 6 or 7 years ago. I joined 3 years ago, and I would say in the time that I have been with Chalk and Blade and ensconced in the UK and US market to some extent with US clients, the amount of times I have to explain what a podcast is has decreased significantly to friends and family. So it's actually weirdly a very good indicator. We've definitely gone from convincing people they want to do a podcast to being someone who can offer the solution for them for their podcasting needs, if you see what I mean. It's a very different mindset, especially for brands and organizations, than it was previously. And it's growing kind of exponentially. Was that everything that you wanted on?
That's great. Yeah. And I'll come back because the brand point I feel that the UK is, has a particularly strong market to that. So if I forget, please remind me, we'll come back to that. You said that there was, a shift, really, I think you said 2009, people start to know more. Was there a particular program or something, Serial in the US really put podcasts on the map? Do you have that sort of comparative story in the UK?
For us, it's the biggest probably difference in the market, definitely in the US and UK. And although I know that some countries have similar, the BBC is really does kind of not necessarily set the trends, but set the kind of what's being used the most. So for example, they have a platform called BBC Sounds, which they've massively promoted in the past couple of years, and that's they've made a cognizant kind of choice to move people towards that, and that means it's a podcast platform. But even before that, it was really when the BBC, when I looked at the timeline earlier, it was really when the BBC started putting their mainstream programs that people listen to every week onto a podcast, so people could catch up with them later. There's a kind of snowball effect from that. But we have a long history in the UK of even like dramas. There's a daily radio drama that happens that was originally started as a government health thing about farming communities, and that's listened to by millions of people. To the extent it changes public mindset on things when it brings up certain topics. So that we have quite a long history of people listening to the radio in a kind of program specific way, which I think is quite unique to the UK market.
Understood. Well, let's see if anyone else also for the market where the radio has played an important role, I'd be interested to see if that's something common to other markets.
I'd like to talk about France. Yes, just a little background. Ochenta is based in Paris, but we work internationally, so I can speak to a couple of different markets. We work multilingually, translating and adapting series into 27 plus languages. So we really have like a depth and breadth of experiences with different podcast markets. But I will speak to France in particular because I've been here since 2015, and it was around 2016, 2017 when podcasting started to grow here. On the independent side, it was very much women journalists doing feminine topics, feminist topics, topics about sex, topics about motherhood. There was a lot of just conversations coming out of women journalists that were kind of working independently in those first couple of years. And then things kind of shifted around 2018 when the conversation at Radio France, like talking about podcasts in a very particular way, what they would call radio replay, which now is they just call podcasts. They're not really saying that it's a different product. They just say it's our podcasts. And there's a real distinction moment where you had podcast natif, which is independent podcasts, versus podcasts, which were Radio France podcasts. So there was a real like dynamic where you had this kind of we're versus Radio France kind of thing, with the independents kind of going in terms of audience, like fighting for the attention of the podcast listener, because simply by using the word podcast as the word podcast to define their radio replays, Radio France basically overtook the entire market in terms of listenership, and perceptions around it actually changed a lot, because they made it so that people kind of understood that this replay or digital product was a podcast. And then in the last couple of years, things have grown a lot. Now, yes, you don't have to explain what a podcast is in France, for sure. And quite a few companies that were started out in 2017, 2018 have been acquired in the last year. So there's been like a real such a growth in the market to the point where we've gotten to have big group interest in the French market. And so, yeah, the presence of radio has been super important to that. And I'll speak just shortly on the LATAM market, which we work quite a bit in as well. And we've seen that growth in a very similar way, in the sense that people are very much in the radio culture. And something that we saw in the very beginning was that Spain's fiction podcasts, nonfiction podcasts from coming out of Prisa Audio and Podium podcasts really kind of set the stage for what we're seeing as the Spanish podcasting boom. And I'd love to talk about it a little bit later, but generally what's happening now in Spanish podcasting is that there's a real kind of cognizance that if you do podcasts in Spanish language, you're really touching on US Spanish speakers, all of LATAM plus Spain and the rest of the diaspora, which has been a really interesting kind of conversation to be having in terms of audience targeting regarding that one particular language. But it's, yeah, it's an exciting time in general to be in international podcasting. And then I can definitely talk about other countries later on.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the translation point, and because that's an interesting one to unpack. Stefano, what's the origin story of podcasts in the Middle Eastern market?
Yeah, first, thanks a lot for organizing this. I think it's insightful to a lot of people as well. So from our end, I'll second what Laurie said regarding radio and the radio culture. It's very much present and still very strong in the entire Middle East and North Africa. So as a landscape, you have around 430 million people that speak Arabic all over the region, out of which around 200 million tune into radio every other week. And that's why, you know, all over the region, there's radios that reach more households than than the televisions. So the culture as MENA-based, as a culture, it's always been this culture of storytelling. And it's always based that, you know, people like to tell stories and listen to stories and constantly consume stories over the past decades, and ever since you know, the culture has been established. So radio reaches and is very significant across the region. Now, when we started in 2019, it was really a problem of, we were still at the chicken and egg or supply and demand sort of problem. And it wasn't until this year that we saw the major and significant shift in consumption from radio to move to on demand. So it's really at this first initial stage of educating people what a podcast is. And I think there was a stat that less than 2% of the entire region knows what a podcast is. So we're still at these very early and nascent stages where we're really educating consumers on how to consume, on what a podcast is, on where to listen, on how to create. And it's an exciting time to operate in, because we sort of had to build tools for creators. I mean, there were less than 1,000 podcasters accumulated over a span of 10 years, ever since podcasting started, all over the MENA region. And that was up until 2022. And then we launched a creator tool to basically democratize the process of getting into podcasting. And something to notice about the culture is that they're very much, it's a culture that relies a lot on hyperlocality. So languages are also, so you have the Arabic language, where it's the most, it's the number one language that people speak in the region. But then you have subdialects, and each country has subdialects as well. So getting, let's say, a podcast out in Saudi is not going to be consumed in Egypt. It's not going to be consumed in Lebanon. It's not going to be consumed in Jordan, so on and so forth. So it's really about that. We're treating it as if it's like multiple markets within one larger market and within one larger language. But to be able to sort of set off that's why we're relying a lot on hyperlocality and hyperlocalizing the platform, hyperlocalizing the experience. And I think so far, you know, we've done a decent job in terms of enabling creators to get into podcasting. So we launched a creator tool 8 months ago. from 8 months ago till now, we onboarded over 25,000 new podcasters that are creating content and creating podcasts, because we sort of localized the experience. We made it accessible for anyone to get into podcasting, and that sort of is being replicated across other larger publishers. So it's really sample sizes, right? If you have 1,000 podcasters, 1% is going to be created by, let's say, the top quality publishers and more advanced creators. So to be able to expand that number, we really had to expand the sample size. To expand the sample size, we had to make it more accessible for people to get into podcasting. And we've seen a lot of the leading publishers now all starting their podcasts. And I think that's a great repercussion on the entire industry. And the strategy was always, build supply first, demand will eventually follow. And then the final plug was essentially monetize the listeners or the listens as well. And that's what we've been doing for the past few months. And that really closes the loop of building the entire podcasting ecosystem and scaling that to reach more markets and to more dialects as well.
That's so interesting, because you really have these sub markets with the different dialects within. And have you seen at all people launching in parallel, like you said, like if you're doing the podcast in Saudi and in Egypt, launching it together, different dialects at the same time, maybe a little bit adapted to the respective cultures, or are there not that many sort of parallel releases yet happening in that way?
Yeah, not at all, actually, because creators, so when a creator starts, creators have their own dialect. So if you're a creator based out of Saudi Arabia, which actually has the highest adoption for the medium, it's around 40 to 45% of Saudi that now is listening and consuming to podcasts, and at least once a month in the past year. So it's a very tech savvy market, Saudi Arabia specifically, and it's one of our largest markets. But then you also see Egypt as a market. For example, you have 100+ million people in Egypt. It's a big market in terms of listeners, but not that big in terms of creators. So you have lesser number of podcasts that are consumed by a higher number of listeners. But in terms of parallels, a creator that's creating a podcast for Saudi and for Egypt, that doesn't really work, because the dialect is different. So his dialect is naturally, his or her dialect are naturally in their mother tongue, essentially. Yeah. But you have publishers that are going into adapting that content within different dialects. And we've seen that. In terms of performance, it's decent, but it's not as good as hyperlocal content.
Well, then segueing to another large market, Yi, tell us about podcasts in China.
Well, of course, when I mentioned to the Chinese podcast market, I have to say, it started at the very beginning of the whole podcasting. I remember in 2005, we already have the Mandarin language speaking podcast, but however, the podcasting, become more widely recognized in China just in past 5 years. And we're very honored at JustPod because we're become I think the promoter of this trade. So now probably I will give you some impressions about the whole Chinese podcast market. Most Chinese podcast listeners are young people, and with the age between 22 to 35, and mainly live in the big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. For them, podcasting is a trendy lifestyle choice, and they enjoy listening to other people's story and conversations. And according to some projections, I remember is the prediction from the eMarketer consulting firm. By the end of 2022, Chinese podcast listeners will have exceeded 100 million. But the number sounds big, but China has 1.4 billion population. So the share is less 10%. So we're growth, but still niche. And in the next 3 years, according to the prediction, the annual growth rates will exceed 15% and leading the major market around the world. So I think there's a big potentials here. And we have some insights about this market. Like today, people have many different ways to entertain themselves, especially with the presence of the Douyin, the originally TikTok, and which has been very popular in China for over 5 years, longer than TikTok in the US or in Europe. So of course, many people enjoy use Douyin to sweep the short video, but they will gradually discover they need other tools too. So people provide them podcasts, provide them with rare moments of like immersion, and where they can listen to people's conversation and people's story and other people's experience, which is a completely different experience from short videos. So I think probably that is the one of the reasons behind why podcasting have grown so rapidly in the past 5 years, and only with a strong comparison can people truly appreciate the value of listening. Yeah.
It's so interesting. And when you and I chatted before this panel, you brought this up also, how, for example, in the US, there's more and more a move towards video, whereas it sounds like in your market, you've had the experience that you went the opposite, right? From video to audio more. And it sounds like in China, you've been experimenting with short form video and TikTok or its equivalent. So it's interesting because that's I think a difference, sort of different reverse track.
Yeah, I have to say this, I heard about your stories about, compare with the radio and the podcast. So in China is a very interesting is, first, maybe you heard about an audio platform called Himalaya. But Himalaya, I think the listeners on Himalaya has a strong connection with the traditional radio, because the users on Himalaya listen to the audiobooks or some traditional performance, live recording. But for podcasts, it's totally different. We did a lot of survey on the Chinese podcast listeners. We have a standard survey continuously for 3 years. We are still tracking the habits of our listeners. So we find, the young those podcast listeners, the young people, they didn't have the radio memories. So before podcasting, they usually didn't listen to any spoken word audio content. So it's totally different from the UK, probably France is very different. And talking about the short video, yes, the TikTok is appeared in China probably in 2016, I remember. And our company is founded in 2018. So when my company launched, the only one question is most people ask me is, everybody is watch TikTok, everybody's watch short video. Is anyone who listens to something? But for me, I think there still have some potential at that moment, because we still believe the long form content has its users, has its customers, has its listeners. But even the TikTok is such big and they attract a lot of audience in this market, but still maybe some people has the willing to listen to the long form thing, anything about long form. So we did this and we do a lot of podcasts. So now we prove, yes, some young people don't want to sweep all the time. They still need to calm down. They still need to immerse. They still need to other people's mind. So long form audio still has its space.
I mean, thank God. So it's interesting. So TikTok, that's a little bit different. I wonder, Lori, Helen, Stefano, is there, maybe people wouldn't have expected or known that the market in China for podcasts is sort of born out of short form video. Is there a facet of your respective markets that you find when you speak to the American counterparts, or just people who are not in your markets, are surprised to find that out about your market, sort of something that's unique or particular to your business? No particular order.
We have, Stefano, you go.
It's cool. So I mean, from our end, I think video is playing a big role in helping listeners discover new podcasts. And that's, I think it's more of a marketing tool that's being used as opposed to publishing full podcasts as videos. so they're using the short form discoverability to be then redirected to the longer form audio on a podcast platform. And from a consumption perspective, I think longer form content isn't really working so far in the region. One, because the habits are more directed towards shorter content. Even from a radio show perspective, they've always been shorter shows on radio. That's one. And two, there's less commutes than in the US. So people, let's say you have a 15-minute ride, most of the people are tuning into like a 15-minute episode, or just turn on the radio and listen to music. So it's less of it's more of a short form consumption market so far.
Got it. Helen, similar for you?
Yeah, we were asked to properly televise for a podcast for the BBC so they put it out on the BBC Sounds platform, but they also put it on actual digital television, not just a streaming service, like out at exactly the same time. So it was our accompanying one. So after people had watched, for example, Killing Eve, they then go after the show, they're directed to one of the BBC's other channels to watch the podcast. And we were quite surprised at how popular that was, and ended up looking quite a lot into it. And actually, I would say, again, with brands as well, everyone wants it videoed now. They might not want to do anything with that video. People are still a bit confused about that, and what you actually do about it. There's some great ones that are kind of video first almost, where it's part of their whole aesthetic. But for most people, it is something they're now increasingly aware of versus, say, 3 years ago. Most of our clients want it filmed, but they're not really sure of the purpose and often end up not doing anything with it.
Have you had a similar experience, Lori?
Not necessarily with video, but I wanted to mention something related to a misconception around, making something in one language and expecting it to work across different markets that have a similar dialect, which I think, Stefano spoke to this before regarding Egyptian Arabic and other forms of Arabic that exist in that region. We have the same thing with Spanish. And I think one of the things, it's a question that's popping up is, if you make a podcast in Spanish, you really have to be very, very deliberate in which Spanish you're talking about, because yes, people will listen to a Spain Spanish podcast in Latin America, but if you're making a show for LatAm, picking which dialect you're going to use of Spanish is going to make a huge difference in terms of who listens. Mexican Spanish is the one that is most standardized, mainly because of dubbing practices in Latin America being from Mexico and Venezuela, which makes that dialect the most accessible for LatAm listeners. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're also going to touch the Spain Spanish listener, because Spain Spanish listener is mainly listening to Spain Spanish radio and audio. And so there's an interesting kind of dichotomy there. And so one thing that we always make sure that whenever we're doing a localization of something in Spanish from English or whatever other language into Spanish, we always make sure we understand which is the target audience. And also recognizing that the US Spanish speaking listener is a very particular target audience that will listen to Spanish, but will also listen to Spanglish and listen to bilingual series. And so, sometimes targeting them is a very different thing, and just being aware of that is important. And we always advise on this kind of thing whenever we're doing localization.
When you're doing localization like this, is it a translation? So just, changing, you have somebody, from Venezuela who's recording instead of Spain, or is it even further a sort of trans adaptation where you're maybe changing things to adapting the story more to the culture, going beyond just a pure translation? I'm calling it a trans adaptation. That might not be the right word, but you know what I'm asking about.
Yeah. It really depends on the project and to what extent the content really needs to change, because depending on the new market or the target market that you're going to, maybe some of the cultural things that you're talking about are relatable and not necessarily necessary to explain. Sometimes They are. Sometimes your listeners, for example, we translated a podcast from English to Danish, and the Danish listeners have more of exposure to English. And so we did leave a little bit of English in the adaptation, for example. And in a German podcast, we left it German. In a Spanish podcast, we were looking at Mexican as the main target, Mexican Spanish as the main target language, because we knew it would, translate to other LATAM countries. But for a podcast that was translated from English to Spain Spanish, where the target audience platform was Spain, we were there. And so whenever we do that, we always make sure that, yes, we translate a base translation, because you have to be true to the original content and you have to be respectful of the original creators, of course, to make sure that you get the messaging and the tone and everything as clear as possible before even having to ask questions around adaptation. The second step is the adaptation and having open conversations about, okay, this is what we know about this market, and talking to the creators very actively and, asking questions like, what do you think about changing this detail? Or, making sure that we explain this detail, because maybe that person may not be exposed to that topic in their country. So let's maybe add one more line to explain that topic. Right. And so it's really on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the show's content and everything, but we always make sure that, yes, you do like the most literal translation first, because you don't want to miss the messaging. And then you go in and you really get nitpicky about not only the tone of voice in the new language, but also the content side. And it can change, but the idea is that it doesn't change so much that it's a completely different show. And that's what makes a successful adaptation in our experience.
So that's successful, adaptations, translations, but I would think there's also interesting opportunities for international collaboration. So going in production companies in different countries together to produce something and, leverage each other's audience and expertise. And so, Yi, I'm curious, have you been doing these sort of international collaborations, or if not, do you see opportunities for it in the future?
Yes, of course. And actually the partner is Laurie. we have produced and distributed the Miha into China in 2020. And now the new project Love Item, we will release the Mandarin version in later this year. So yes, of course. I think in Chinese market, we only have 30,000 podcasts, around 30,000 podcasts, especially compare with English language podcast is very small supply. So I think people, more and more listeners here, so they want new, different shows, format, genre, something like that. So I think, of course, it has opportunity. But I think in my mind, the most important thing is not just about, the production or translation into Mandarin or in China. It's monetization. So I think Laurie knows that because in 2020, when we introduced the Miha into China, there's no advertisement here. So now the things become better. First is like JustPod. In the past 5 years, we try to find a good way to monetize for our company. So the answer is branded podcast. So now in China, the background is, what I saw is the post-TikTok society, as I mentioned before, because when podcasting become popular in China, TikTok is already there. The audience loves TikTok, and advertisers and marketers love TikTok. They already know how efficient TikTok could do. So when the podcasting peers, the advertisers and the marketer truly need a clue to find what is the different from the podcast and the short videos. So finally they find the value. Okay, of course we educate. We already we are educate some part of them, but finally they find a value. The value is they find listening could give a brand or enterprises enough space to tell their own story. And this own story is not just about what they do. It is by their own ways, their very unique way to tell the story. Because when you publish a short video on TikTok, if you want to attract more audience, you need to use we call the formula way to produce a 60-second video. Like you have to, put 5 seconds, first 5 seconds there, and put that, the next 10 seconds here. So it is a formula, because that formula could attract more audience. But for a brand, they will think, okay, if I produce a lot of that kind of short videos where I am, who I am, it is not me. It is the something the audience like, but it's not me. But for podcasts, they find, okay, we could tell my story in my own ways. And more than that, I usually tell my client is, China podcast is only, 20 to 30,000 podcasts here. So there's still a lot of different content. No any podcaster already did. So if you very interested in this area, if you are very good at in some industry or topics or issue, please do a podcast. Not just brand yourself. Just be the number one. Show your number one. Show your leading in your whole industry. So the enterprises and brands truly produce a lot of good show in China. So that is what I say, we truly find some good way to monetize. But on the other hand, the original podcast, I have to say there's just, at the very early stage about monetize. So Laurie, probably I would say, sorry, maybe Love Item will find a sponsorship, but maybe not, because there's no DAI in China. There's only a sponsorship or a sponsor episode right now in China for the original podcast. But we still working on it. Yeah.
Sorry, but I think that's important to focus on. I don't think people realize that. So there's no sort of the ad sort of markets in China would be through sponsorship. It's not going to be through dynamically inserted ads or things like that.
Yes, there's no DAI here. Because I have to say, because maybe it is because the reason is the scale of the listeners I mentioned before, because it's only less than 10% listener of the whole population who is the podcast listeners. Yeah.
Stefano, do you have a similar experience?
Yeah.
The state
I just wanted to.
For you.
I wanted to add something on the adaptation first. I think there was only one podcast that got adapted to in Arabic, which is Business Wars. So
we did
basically
one.
Jazeera.
We did one to Arabic as well, Binti, in Egyptian Arabic.
Yeah.
Around the same time.
Yeah. So the first adaptation happened. That was Business Wars. It was probably 3-4 years ago, and Al Jazeera bought the license from Wondery to do that. I think that's the only one or probably the first one. But in terms of like larger shows, there haven't been any significant ones, probably other than the one that Laurie mentioned as well. From a programmatic perspective or DAI, I mean, there wasn't any DAI until we actually had to build the ad tech to be able to do that. And now we're opening up all of the inventory to multiple ad exchanges, so trading desk and multiple DSPs as well. So that's on one end. And then on the other hand, there's naturally the direct deals that we need to do to be able to help creators match them with specific brands, and that's done through a marketplace. But I mean, from a sponsorship perspective, or for the whole street ads, we're still using the DAI regardless. So regardless if it's a sponsorship or it's an ad that was pulled in from one of the trading desks or DSPs, we're using DAI to do that. For the sponsorship not to stay for the next 10 years or as long as the episode is available.
Okay. And the Business Wars, that was, I mean, it's not a translation, it's an adaptation. It's written purely for an Arabic market, right? Or it was a translation?
No, it was a translation.
It was a translation.
Yeah, it was a translation. Yeah.
Well, because I know sometimes Business Wars, I think they pick like a local, more local war.
Right. No, it was purely a translation of just in Arabic, the same topic, same scripts, but in Arabic.
Yeah, Alexia, I want to add one more fact is mentioned to the adaptation. The actually Business War has a Mandarin version, and it's distributed by Himalaya in 4 years ago in 2019, I remember. But I have to say, there's any podcast listeners knows that. Any podcast listeners know there is a Mandarin version of Business War just right here available in China. Because I have to say this, if any like foreign production house want to produce their show adoption into China, you have to choose a right I have to say partner, because in China, audio is a big market, but the podcast and the traditional radio and the audiobook is totally different and separate market. So you have to find your target audience in right place, in right way. So that is what happened in China. Yeah.
Good word of caution. I mean, so Helen and Lori, you come from markets where the brand market and ad market is quite strong. So, Helen, how big, in terms of the overall market, is that still? It seems like at least it was at a time a very robust demand. Like a lot of brands were doing audio.
I would say it's robust, but not a massive share of the market in terms of so splitting the idea of commissioned revenue, where people are paying for a podcast to produce irrelevant of the ads. We obviously have we also have a weird thing in the UK where obviously the BBC doesn't have ads on any of its TV, or it's publicly funded, so there's no ads on TV, films, podcasts, radio, etc. So we have a kind of different thing where people are used to it. So I think you don't see brands monetizing their own podcast, for example, because they know it will put people off. But the brands market, I would say, is robust. Most brands would like to do a podcast. The real difficulty, which I think from talking to people internationally, is kind of an international issue still for the podcast market, is the data and proving ROI for brands, like who listens to my podcast, did they then go to my website? There's obviously solutions coming out for this, and a lot of the big tech companies, usually American tech companies, but they are servicing everybody, are putting a lot of energy into that at the moment. So I think we'll see some technologies coming out, but that's kind of the biggest issue with getting people to spend across the line or do a more interesting show than, because it costs, the more interesting the show is, the more it costs, do a more interesting show than just a chit chat. And because of the boom in podcast titles, and in English speaking podcast titles in the past 2 years, it's extremely hard for those poorer quality ones to get seen or heard because no one wants to listen to them because it's not very good. So we've seen brands removing those podcasts despite having probably spent quite a lot of time and effort on them, but they're not, they were just there, their head of marketing having a chat with like their CEO, and it turned out nobody really wants to listen to that. So we're seeing a demand coming through for more innovative podcasts from brands who have money. We're obviously in a recession as is a lot of people, but we're still seeing the companies that are making money wanting to do that. It just takes a long lead time because they're used to doing marketing I come from a e-commerce background, and they're used to doing their marketing in a digital display marketing way, and they're used to knowing what they spend, who sees it, and what their funnels are, and that's what everyone in marketing is trained in being the most important thing. They're not creators, they're numbers people. So it's getting that translation across is what I spend quite a lot of time trying to help them do.
I can also talk about the way that monetization is presented across different markets. What we've seen, because we release shows simultaneously in multiple languages, is that each market has its own type of monetization, and the answer is non-advertising for most markets outside of the US. One reason might be because, advertising is not the cultural thing. In France, when I first started out, the thing that I was always hearing is, why can't we monetize podcasts? Well, because French people don't like to hear ads. And it's just a cultural thing. They just don't have the same ad culture as Americans. Like
everything else, they're so easygoing.
Yeah, like Super Bowl ads are amazing for Americans, but the French are not necessarily interested. And that's a cultural thing. And that's, that is something to be aware of. And so something that sprouted up a lot in Europe that we've seen in France as well, but also in the Nordics, has been subscription platforms. So, you have your Spotify, but you also have your Podimo. You also have an upcoming one that I've seen that's called Podme. There's a Storytel. There's a lot of really interesting subscription-based platforms that are kind of using the audio product, like audiobooks plus podcasts, as something to draw thousands and thousands and millions of listeners across the different European markets. And so that's something that we've seen that's been really interesting. And that is also being duplicated in other markets where advertising is just not the first monetization thing. You'll
Mhm.
have Patreon is really big in LATAM, and you also have again subscription platforms like Podimo in Mexico, like they're using advertising. Another thing that we've seen is the YouTube monetization, because in the same way that, you know, TikTok has a lot of users, but you can't monetize them directly. What's happening and what we've been seeing is that there's a push towards using YouTube as a way to monetize certain kinds of podcasts, because the video aspect is there, plus you get YouTube ads, which are a way for you to monetize, which is much more direct than a podcast ad that maybe in a market where it's not necessarily well known that there's advertising for podcasts. It can be on YouTube because people understand that across every market in the world. And so that's what we've seen as well.
From our end,
I was
from
going to ask Stefan,
subscriptions.
do you see a similar resistance to ads culturally?
No, actually, it's quite the opposite. So there's a resistance for subscriptions. Essentially, even for music. So Angami, which is essentially the largest Arabic music app, they have around 25 million monthly active users, out of which less than 2 are paid. And that's like quite a low conversion, because you have this assumption that content should be free, and people, you know, that's the reality of the culture. So when we initially started, we were building this ultra high premium library of original shows with the hopes of eventually monetizing the listener. And then midway through that, we're like, if people aren't paying for music, then they're definitely not going to pay for podcasts, especially that they have already an open library of millions of shows that they can listen to on Apple and Google and Spotify and all of these different platforms. So we had to shift monetization strategies to focus on ad tech, and ad tech is working very well for us.
Interesting. So you'd had to do a nimble midway pivot.
Yeah, sort of.
I think we've covered a lot of the questions that have been somewhat dropped in the chat, but a few, which is, I think, interesting, good practice is a question from Michal, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, but what are good practices for a pitch if you're a podcast that's looking to sell language rights to another market? So if either of you are getting into a meeting room and you want to pitch and sell rights to your podcast for adaptations, what are some of the arguments there, or what makes for a good pitch for that to adapt your shows?
I can speak to that because we do a lot of partnerships for licensing, and then we work on the adaptations eventually with whatever platform decides to purchase the license. And one of the things that we're seeing, and I can say with complete honesty, the trends of true crime are popular around the world. That is a kind of show, a genre of show that is popular for licensing. And I would say also that narrative podcasts, chat podcasts are not easy to adapt or license, because you have to have a brand new host in the language that kind of loses the original charm of the series. And so a lot of the time, if you are going to adapt something that is into another language, or if you're like seeking to, sell a package of episodes, like I want to sell 30 episodes for license to German or something, you have to be aware that, if the host is an incredibly important part of the branding around the show, then it's not as easy to adapt it to another language unless you kind of call it a spin-off, and then it's a completely different show and you have to kind of be able to part with that. And that is a deal I've seen, but it's not necessarily the most common one. The most common one really is going to be a narrative series like Business Wars, like Miha, like a lot of the series that we've seen that have been adapted, which are narrative single, either single voice or double or 2 voices max, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, just kind of making it easier to translate, and also making it possible to really shape the story or, adapt the script so that the local audience can really understand it and not have to like completely change the content, And so those are the things that I've seen. And the best way to approach people, I think, would be to kind of reach out to local folks. So if you're looking at, if you're interested in a market and you say, I think I've got a lot of listeners on my English podcast in Germany. This is just a, random example. I see that in my listener stats on Acast, I have a lot of people in Germany. Maybe I should translate my show to German. Well, before you go and do that, before you go and seek out anybody who is going to be interested in licensing your show, understand the German market. See if there are other shows that are very similar to yours. Even partnering with another indie podcaster who has that and doing a mini series with them could be more interesting to you than going like full on translating your series. Indie producers have a different capacity to translate than podcast platforms, podcast platforms can say, yeah, I think that we have some listeners in Germany. Well, let's translate the whole show and then do marketing around it. If they have those resources, yes. But if you're an indie producer and you're seeing this kind of thing, you're more than likely, you're much better off going, in a smaller route to kind of start off. And then if you're looking to license to a platform, then it's always important to do your research beforehand, of course. But then also remember these other key things that I said, which is like the format has to be easy to adapt. And like you have to see if the genre is interesting to that market. I'm not saying that it has to be true crime. It can be anything, because we did fiction with Yi earlier this year. And this year we're working on something like that. And so just kind of be aware of what other shows exist in that market and see if, you can appeal to that audience and say, okay, there are like 20 other podcasts about this show, this format, or this genre, or this topic, or whatever. And I think our show can contribute to that conversation. We're not just kind of showing up as the foreigner in this market. Be aware that you're entering a space that might already have listeners with this content. And so that's something to be aware of.
Those are great practical tips. Thanks, Lori. Does anyone have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I have a point is talking about adoption. I think that the format licensing probably has a potential opportunity, because I was a TV network producer, so I know the format selling is a really big market. So if the show is probably the narrative podcast, then maybe you are the narrative podcast, so you could find different people's story in different local market, but the format is the same. And if you are a gaming show, probably the game is the same, but you find a different attendees in different local markets. So I think probably format is also a business, but actually you have to say for now we didn't see more the case, but I think there's potential a market for international.
For sure. I mean, format licensing and derivative adaptations is a panel in and of its own. We have a couple of minutes. This is an interesting one. Christopher, nice to see you. A question for the panelists who interact with the US market. What are some unique or major difficulties in working with the US industry from an outside perspective? No one's feelings are going to get hurt. You can speak candidly.
Shall I go?
Please, sounds like you have something to
Yeah,
say.
we do quite a few. I think top one is, at the moment, everybody's trying for IP, and that's very true of the UK and US market, especially when interacting with each other. And to Laurie's point, I think one of the things you have to bear in mind, and this was a subject quite a lot of podcast movement of chats I had with people, you have to bear in mind, like, there's no point keeping IP for something you can't sell again in another market. Like, if you're making a chatty show between two people, like, get paid for it, and don't, get paid for it and give up your IP as leverage, because it's probably not, or give up more proportion of it because it's probably not that useful. And then I would say aggressive, no offense, Alexia at all, American lawyers, especially with talent. I've spoken to quite a few people because you need a host attached to do a deal, and it usually has to be the right person, where we've had American talent, especially if they're Hollywood talent, then it's very easy to see how it could fall apart over. I was talking to someone last week who said had a deal that fell apart because for a podcast, a hair and makeup person wouldn't be provided. It's that kind of, the agents will have their thing that their talent needs, and they aren't used enough to the podcast market yet to understand they're just applying what they have always done in TV and film, and in a very this is how it's done type of way. That's also true of British agents, to be fair, but it does seem a little bit more of a standoff point in America. And also trying to get, I've definitely had it, we've been repeatedly told that we need to be under American law even when the production's in the UK, and that actually has been a massive blocker, which took like 5 rounds of red line to get over. So I would say just be prepared for those and do your research to convince them that, because these people often just haven't worked in your market before. And they just need to know that the production lives in yours, not in America, just because the person's doing recording there. But that's about understanding the law in both countries.
Yeah. And being practical and understanding, you know, I take no offense. I hear you. People need to remember, when you put the phone down, these people need to go and make a podcast together. So
yeah.
I believe that just about brings us to time. So Yi, Helen, Lori, Stefano, thank you so much for being generous with your time, your insights, your experiences. You know, I'm so excited to see everything that's happening in your markets, and I hope that we keep these conversations going, because it really is an exciting international community. So really thank you all very much, and thank you to the Podcast Academy for giving us time to have this chat.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And as our panelists excuse themselves to attend to all these business making and deals and transliteration, which sounds very time consuming, I again want to thank all of our amazing panelists. Folks who are new to TPA, this is an example of the types of educational offerings we have here at the Podcast Academy. If you've heard this before, you're going to know what I'm going to say. Please join us. We are we're thousands across the globe here. I love seeing all the dialogue in the chat. That's a really good example of the interactions we have both on Slack, which is everybody's favorite place to network virtually right now, as well as at in-person conferences. We also have in the New York City area next Tuesday an in-person social. So if any of you happen to be in New York, come through. That is posted on our public website. Into the chat, I dropped a link on how to join TPA. And again, as I mentioned, everybody who came here is going to receive a 50% off link to join TPA. And if you send me a personal note to education at the Podcast Academy, heck, I don't even know what I can help you out on. But anyway, we're really glad to have had you here. Thank you again so much, Alexia, Yi, Helen, Lori, and certainly to our panelists who had to drop off as well, Stefano. If you have further questions, TPA folks, continue the discussion in the general channel on Slack. That is absolutely where some potentially panelists might be there to potentially answer some of those questions. I've been Amanda. You all have been wonderful. Have a great remaining week, and best wishes on all those deals, acquisitions in the new normal. Always things happening in this world. So bye, everybody. I'm going to stop recording, and thank you again.